Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, lower the lights, get comfortable, and let the world slow down. Here we tell quiet stories from history, not the loud ones filled with battles and dates, but the everyday stories most people never think about. The small details, the forgotten systems, the things that shaped millions of lives without anyone noticing. Tonight's story is about something we use every day and almost never think about: bathrooms. In the Middle Ages, there were no clean rooms, no flushing water, no pipes hidden in walls. There was only survival and the quiet danger that came with it. This is not a story about dirt. It is a story about people, about how they lived, adapted, and endured in a world without modern comfort. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful history like this, stories meant to calm the mind while awakening curiosity, consider subscribing. New episodes are released regularly, each one designed to help you rest, reflect, and see the past a little differently. Now let's step back in time and begin.
Chapter 1: What bathrooms meant in the Middle Ages. When we hear the word bathroom, most of us imagine a small, private room. A door that locks, a toilet that flushes, running water, maybe even warm tiles under our feet. In the Middle Ages, none of that existed. In fact, the idea of a bathroom as a single, clean, private space simply did not exist at all. Medieval people did not wake up and walk down a hallway to use a dedicated room meant only for human waste. Instead, going to the toilet was something woven quietly into daily life, shaped by necessity, architecture, and survival. To understand medieval bathrooms, we first have to let go of modern expectations. There was no plumbing, no pipes hidden in walls, no sewage system carrying waste far away. Everything stayed close, very close. And because of that, medieval sanitation was not about comfort. It was about coping. No bathroom, just solutions. In the Middle Ages, there was no single word that meant bathroom the way we use it today. Instead, people had solutions. Each one was imperfect, temporary, and often unpleasant. What you used depended on where you lived, how much money you had, and what kind of building you were in. A peasant's home had one solution. A castle had another. A city apartment had something else entirely. And none of them were great. Medieval people didn't ask, "Where is the bathroom?" They asked, "Where do I go right now?" The privy, the most basic option. The most common toilet was something called a privy. A privy was usually a small wooden structure, often outside, sometimes attached to a house. Inside there was a simple hole or seat. Underneath that hole was either bare ground or a pit dug into the earth. That pit would slowly fill with waste. When it got too full, someone had to empty it, or dig a new one. Privies were basic, but they were practical. They kept waste away from living spaces at least a little. But they also came with problems: smells, flies, and the constant risk of the pit leaking into nearby soil or water. Still, for many medieval families, a privy was better than nothing. And many had nothing. The chamber pot, the indoor companion. When going outside wasn't possible, especially at night, people relied on the chamber pot. A chamber pot was exactly what it sounds like. A portable container, often made of ceramic, metal, or wood, kept inside the home. Sometimes under the bed. Sometimes in a corner. You used it, covered it, and dealt with it later. Everyone used chamber pots. Peasants, merchants, nobles, even kings. They were normal, accepted, and necessary. But they also meant that human waste often stayed inside living spaces for hours, sometimes longer. In the morning, the contents had to be emptied. Into a privy, into a cesspit, into the street, or into a nearby ditch or river. This system worked only if everyone followed the rules. They often did not. Garderobes, the castle toilet. In castles and large stone buildings, there was a more advanced option called a garderobe. A garderobe was a toilet built into the thickness of a stone wall. From the outside, it looked like a small stone box sticking out from the building. Inside, it was a narrow seat with a hole. Gravity did the work. Waste fell straight down, either into a pit, a moat, or open ground below. For its time, this was clever design. No carrying waste. No chamber pot to empty. Just sit, go, and let it fall away. But away didn't mean far. Over time, waste piled up beneath these garderobes. In some castles, the pits became so full that the smell rose back up into the building. In others, waste seeped into foundations or water sources. Even stone walls couldn't keep the problem contained forever. Cesspits, the hidden danger. Many homes, especially in towns and cities, relied on cesspits. A cesspit was a hole dug into the ground, lined with stone or wood, meant to collect waste. Privies, garderobes, and even household drains often led to these pits. They were hidden beneath courtyards, basements, or streets. And that was the problem. Cesspits didn't just hold waste. They leaked. Slowly and silently. Liquids seeped into the surrounding soil. If a well was nearby, clean drinking water could become contaminated without anyone realizing it. There was no smell at first. No warning sign. People drank the water anyway. This is one of the reasons medieval sanitation was so dangerous. The threat was often invisible. Why plumbing didn't exist yet? It's easy to wonder why medieval people didn't just invent plumbing sooner. The answer is simple. Plumbing requires more than pipes. It requires infrastructure. You need reliable water pressure, durable materials, sewers that go somewhere safe, a city planned for waste removal. Medieval cities grew fast and randomly. Streets were narrow. Buildings were packed together. There was no central planning for sanitation. Even when people understood that waste caused illness, they lacked the tools to fix it properly. They weren't ignorant. They were limited. Design shaped by survival. Every medieval toilet design was shaped by one goal: survival. People needed a way to deal with waste without dying from it too quickly. Comfort came second. Privacy came third. Cleanliness came last. Designs used gravity because it was free. They used pits because digging was cheaper than building. They reused spaces because land was valuable. Nothing was wasted, including waste. Human waste was sometimes used as fertilizer. Collected, sold, and spread on fields. Dangerous, yes, but necessary for food production. Sanitation wasn't separate from life. It was part of the system that kept people alive. Sanitation was never about comfort. Medieval people did not expect comfort from their toilets. They expected function. If it worked, it worked. If it smelled, that was normal. If it was dangerous, that was life. They lived with risk every day. Disease, hunger, cold, war. Sanitation was just one more thing to manage. And despite all of this, medieval societies survived for centuries using these systems. Not because they were good systems, but because they were the best available at the time. In the next chapter, we'll step even closer into daily life and look at the most common solution of all, the chamber pot, and what it was really like to live with one day after day. For now, rest. History has a way of making modern comforts feel very quiet and very precious. Chapter 2, the chamber pot, the most common solution. If there was one object that connected nearly everyone in the Middle Ages, it was not a sword, a crown, or a Bible. It was the chamber pot. Quietly sitting in bedrooms, corners, and under beds, the chamber pot was the most common solution to a very human problem. It was not elegant. It was not pleasant. But it was practical. And for medieval people, that was enough. The chamber pot was used daily, nightly, and sometimes urgently. It was a normal part of life, talked about casually, joked about, and rarely questioned. In many ways, the chamber pot was the medieval bathroom. What chamber pots were made of? Chamber pots came in many forms depending on wealth and location. Poor households often used simple pots made of wood or rough clay. These were basic, easy to make, and easy to replace. They did the job, but they also absorbed smells over time. Not ideal, but nothing in medieval sanitation really was. Middle-class families used ceramic chamber pots. These were glazed on the inside, which helped a little with cleaning. Some even had simple decorations like lines or patterns. A small attempt at dignity, perhaps. The wealthy used metal chamber pots. Bronze, brass, or even silver in royal households. These were easier to clean and lasted longer. But functionally they were no different. Waste is waste, no matter the container. Some chamber pots had lids. Some did not. Some had handles. Some were shaped more like bowls. But all shared the same purpose. They waited patiently for use. We used them, everyone. There was no shame in using a chamber pot. Kings used them. Queens used them. Monks used them. Children used them. If you slept indoors, you likely used a chamber pot. At night, going outside was dangerous. Streets were dark. Animals wandered freely. Thieves were common. Weather was unpredictable. Using a chamber pot indoors was safer and warmer. Even castles relied heavily on chamber pots, especially during winter or sieges. Garderobes were useful but not always nearby, and walking through cold stone halls at night was not appealing. So the chamber pot stayed close. Very close. The morning routine. Using the chamber pot was only half the process. Morning was when the real work began. Someone had to empty it. In wealthy homes, servants handled this task. In modest homes, it was done by whoever woke up first. Often women, sometimes children, sometimes anyone unlucky enough to be closest. The pot was carefully carried outside. Spills were avoided if possible. Accidents happened anyway. Where did the contents go? That depended on where you lived, where the waste went. In rural areas, waste was often dumped into a privy pit or a cesspit. Sometimes it was poured onto fields, where it mixed with animal manure and later used as fertilizer. In towns and cities, things were more complicated. Some waste went into cesspits beneath homes. Some was dumped into open drains or gutters. Some was thrown directly into the street, often with a warning shout to anyone below. In some cities, there were rules about when and where waste could be dumped. Early morning was common. Late at night was also popular. Enforcement was inconsistent. Rivers were another option. Waste flowed away at least for a while. Unfortunately, rivers were also used for drinking water downstream. Out of sight did not mean out of danger. The smell everyone accepted. Smell was part of medieval life. People lived close together. Animals lived close too. Fires burned constantly. Waste was everywhere. The smell of chamber pots was not shocking. It was normal. Homes were ventilated by open windows and doors. Herbs and flowers were sometimes used to mask odors. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were popular choices. But masking is not removing. People learned to ignore smells. Children grew up surrounded by them. What we might find unbearable, medieval people barely noticed after a while. This desensitization was both useful and dangerous. Privacy was different back then. Privacy as we understand it today was rare. Many families lived in one or two rooms. Chamber pots were used behind curtains, under blankets, or simply turned away from others. In large households, multiple people shared sleeping spaces. Using a chamber pot was discreet but not private. This was normal. There was no embarrassment attached. Bodily functions were accepted as part of life. Silence was polite. Complaints were not. Social norms and etiquette. Despite the lack of privacy, there were rules. You did not spill if you could help it. You emptied your pot responsibly, at least in theory. You did not throw waste without warning. In cities, people shouted phrases before dumping waste from windows. This gave passers-by a chance to move. It did not always work. Some people ignored the rules. Some followed them carefully. Like today, social norms existed, but enforcement depended on mood and convenience. Human nature has not changed much. Why this system almost worked? Surprisingly, the chamber pot system almost worked. It separated waste from living spaces, at least temporarily. It allowed people to avoid dangerous nighttime trips outside. It gave households control over disposal. For small populations, this system could function reasonably well. The problem was scale. As cities grew, the volume of waste increased. Cesspits filled faster. Streets became more crowded. Water sources became contaminated. The system was stretched beyond its limits. But for centuries, it was the best available option. Not because it was good, but because it was manageable. A fragile balance. The chamber pot represents a fragile balance between necessity and danger. It allowed medieval life to continue. It also quietly contributed to disease and contamination. People did what they could with what they had. And most of the time, that was enough to survive. In the next chapter, we will look at a more permanent solution built into stone itself, the garderobe, and why even castles could not escape the problems of waste. For now, let the image of a simple pot remind you how close history really is. Some comforts are worth appreciating, especially the quiet ones. Chapter 3: Garderobes. Toilets built into stone walls. When people imagine medieval castles, they often think of tall towers, thick stone walls, and narrow windows. What they rarely think about is where everyone went to the toilet. The answer is hidden in the walls themselves. These toilets were called garderobes, and for medieval architecture, they were considered quite clever. Not comfortable. Not pleasant. but clever. The garderobe is one of the most iconic bathroom features of the Middle Ages, even if most visitors walk past them today without noticing what they really were. What a garderobe was. A garderobe was a small toilet built directly into the stone wall of a castle or large building. Inside it was simple. A narrow stone seat, a hole in the middle, often just enough room for one person to sit, sometimes barely that. From the outside, garderobes looked like small stone boxes sticking out from the wall. They were usually placed high above the ground. There was no water, no flushing, no pipe, just a hole, stone, and gravity. That was the system. Why castles had them? Castles were not just homes. They were military structures. Safety came first. Going outside the castle walls to use a toilet was dangerous, especially during war, raids, or sieges. Even walking across the courtyard at night could be risky. So castles needed toilets inside the structure. Garderobes solved this problem. They allowed people to use the toilet without leaving the safety of thick stone walls. Lords, ladies, guards, servants, and soldiers all depended on them. They were placed in private chambers, near bedrooms, and sometimes in shared areas for guards. The location mattered. Convenience mattered. Survival mattered more. How gravity did the work. The garderobe system relied entirely on gravity. When someone used the toilet, the waste fell straight down through the hole. There was no container, no chamber pot, no cleaning afterward. The idea was simple. Let gravity remove the problem. Where the waste landed depended on the castle's design and location. And this is where things get interesting. Waste dropping into moats. Some garderobes emptied directly into the castle moat. At first this seemed practical. Moats were already filled with water. Waste would wash away, carried off by movement or diluted over time. But moats were often stagnant. The water did not flow quickly. Waste built up. Over time, moats became thick, foul-smelling pools. Not just defensive barriers, but slow-moving mixtures of waste, animal remains, and garbage. This made moats dangerous in unexpected ways. Soldiers who fell in could become sick. Wounds became infected. The water itself became a health risk. The moat protected the castle. It also quietly poisoned it. Waste dropping into pits. Other garderobes emptied into deep pits dug below the castle walls. These pits collected waste over time, much like large cesspits. In theory, they could be cleaned out when full. In reality, this was unpleasant, dangerous work. The pits filled faster than expected. Cleaning them required people to enter toxic spaces with little air. Sometimes the pits were ignored for years. Waste built up. Smell rose upward. Gases formed. Stone absorbed moisture and odor. What started as a clever design slowly became a problem trapped beneath the castle. Waste dropping onto open ground. Some garderobes simply emptied onto open ground outside the castle walls. Waste fell down the stone face and collected at the base. This was common in early castles or temporary fortifications. It was simple and required no digging. But the area below quickly became filthy. Insects gathered. Animals wandered through. Rain washed waste into nearby soil and water. Over time, this created unhealthy zones directly beside castle walls. Not ideal for a place meant to be defended and lived in. Why this design felt advanced? For its time, the garderobe was considered advanced. It removed waste from living spaces. It reduced handling. It used gravity instead of labor. Compared to chamber pots and indoor pits, garderobes felt like progress. They also reflected the engineering mindset of the Middle Ages. Use what you have. Build strong. Let nature do the work. Stone castles were expensive and carefully planned. Adding a built-in toilet felt modern, even luxurious. For a while it worked well enough. That enough is important. The hidden dangers beneath. The problem with garderobes was not what people could see. It was what they could not. Waste did not disappear. It accumulated. Moats became contaminated. Pits overflowed. Soil absorbed liquids. Water sources nearby became unsafe. In some cases, garderobes weakened castle walls. Moisture from waste seeped into stone and mortar. Over time, this caused damage. There is even evidence that enemies sometimes exploited garderobes. In rare cases, attackers used waste chutes as weak points to enter castles. A reminder that every solution creates new problems. What seemed like an elegant system slowly revealed its flaws. Smell, cold, and reality. Using a garderobe was not comfortable. Stone seats were cold. Drafts moved freely through wall openings. Smells rose from below, especially in warm weather. There was no privacy beyond a wooden door or curtain. Sound traveled easily through stone passages. Still, people used them daily. Comfort was not expected. Function was a system that could not scale. Garderobes worked best when castles were small and populations limited. As castles expanded and housed more people, waste increased. Pits filled faster. Moats became thicker. During sieges, the problem grew worse. People were trapped inside. Waste could not be removed. Disease spread more easily. The very system meant to protect life became a quiet threat to it. Stone could not solve everything. The garderobe shows us something important about medieval life. People were not careless. They were not foolish. They built with skill and intention. But without modern sanitation knowledge and infrastructure, even strong stone walls could not solve the problem of human waste. The danger was not dramatic. It was slow, quiet, invisible, and that made it more deadly. In the next chapter, we will step beyond castle walls and into growing medieval cities, where the problem of waste multiplied and where no stone wall could contain it. For now, rest. Even the strongest castles had weak points. Sometimes they were built right into the wall. Chapter 4: Castles and Kings Were Not Cleaner. It is easy to assume that rich people in the Middle Ages lived cleaner, healthier lives than everyone else. After all, they lived in castles. They had servants. They ate better food. They wore nicer clothes. Surely they had better toilets too. They did not. In fact, when it came to sanitation, wealth often made things worse. Royal latrines versus peasant solutions. At first glance, royal toilets seemed impressive. Kings and queens used garderobes built into thick stone walls. Some castles had multiple latrines stacked on top of each other, all draining into the same pit or moat. This looked advanced compared to a simple wooden privy behind a peasant's house. But appearances were misleading. Peasants lived in smaller homes with fewer people. Their waste was spread out across fields and open land. Castles, on the other hand, concentrated people and waste into tight spaces. A peasant family might have one privy for a few people. A castle could have dozens of people using the same waste system. Stone walls did not change that math. Shared toilets in castles. Privacy in castles was limited, especially outside royal chambers. Many garderobes were shared. Guards used them. Servants used them. Guests used them. Sometimes entire floors relied on the same latrine system. There were no schedules. No cleaning crews waiting between uses. And no way to flush anything away. The waste simply piled up below. Smell traveled upward. Flies found their way in. And during busy times, the system was pushed far beyond what it could handle. Sharing a toilet sounds normal to us today. Sharing one without running water is a different story. Overflow during sieges. The real nightmare began during sieges. When a castle was under attack, people could not leave. Supplies were limited. Stress was high. And sanitation quickly became a serious problem. Waste pits filled faster than usual. Moats became thicker and more foul. Cleaning was delayed or abandoned entirely. In some sieges, latrines overflowed into courtyards or lower rooms. Smell became unbearable. Disease spread more easily among people already weakened by hunger. Ironically, the strongest castles became some of the most dangerous places to be. The walls kept enemies out. They also kept waste in. Waste accumulation in enclosed spaces. Castles were built to be sealed and secure. That worked well for defense. It worked poorly for sanitation. Waste did not have anywhere to go. Air circulation was limited. Stone absorbed moisture and odor. In warm months, the smell could linger in hallways and chambers. Even royal rooms were not immune. Kings slept only a few steps away from their garderobes. Queens had chamber pots nearby. Servants moved waste through corridors daily. The idea of a clean, fresh castle is mostly a myth. They were impressive. They were powerful. They were not sanitary. Why wealth didn't protect against disease? Disease does not care about titles. Bacteria did not avoid castles. Parasites did not respect crowns. Contaminated water affected everyone equally. In fact, wealth sometimes increased exposure. Rich people hosted feasts. They invited guests. They lived in crowded environments with many servants moving between rooms. Every extra person meant more waste. Every extra room meant another place for contamination to hide. When illness appeared, it spread quickly. Royal courts experienced frequent outbreaks of dysentery, fever, and stomach illness. Many rulers died young, not from battle, but from infection. Luxury could not protect them. Historical irony: more comfort, more risk. Here is the irony. The richer you were, the more likely you were to live indoors, surrounded by others, using shared sanitation systems. Peasants worked outdoors. Their waste was spread across land. Air moved freely. Water sources were simpler, though still risky. Nobles lived inside stone walls. Air was trapped. Waste accumulated below floors and within walls. Comfort increased exposure. Luxury increased risk. The very things meant to improve life quietly made it more dangerous. Servants were not a solution. It might seem that servants solved these problems. They did not. Servants carried waste. They cleaned pits. They worked in dangerous conditions. Many became sick themselves. When servants fell ill, the system collapsed. Waste removal slowed. Smell increased. Disease spread upward from servants' quarters to noble chambers. In a castle, no one was truly separate. Everything was connected. Castles look clean in paintings. Much of our misunderstanding comes from art. Paintings show castles as bright, orderly places. Stone floors are clean. Air seems fresh. People look healthy. Artists did not paint the smell. They did not paint the flies. They did not paint the waste pits beneath the floors. Reality was quieter and far less pleasant. Kings were still human. Kings used chamber pots at night. Queens dealt with the same problems as everyone else. Royal children got sick from bad water. Status did not change biology. When a medieval king fell ill, doctors blamed bad air or divine punishment. Rarely did they suspect sanitation. The real cause often sat silently beneath their feet. The illusion of clean power. Castles symbolized control and strength. But sanitation exposed their weakness. Waste management required planning, labor, and constant maintenance. Without modern tools, even the most powerful people struggled to control it. This chapter reminds us of something important. The Middle Ages were not divided simply into clean rich people and dirty poor people. Everyone lived close to danger. Some just lived closer to stone walls. In the next chapter, we will leave castles behind and step into medieval cities, where thousands of people lived side by side, and where sanitation became a shared problem on a massive scale. For now, rest. Even kings could not escape the basics of being human. Chapter 5: Cities Without Sewers. If castles had sanitation problems, medieval cities had something much bigger. Scale. Cities in medieval Europe grew fast. Too fast. Walls went up to protect people, but those same walls trapped everything inside. People, animals, food, smoke, and waste all shared the same limited space. There were no sewers under the streets. No pipes carrying waste away. Everything stayed above ground, in plain sight, and often underfoot. This is where sanitation stopped being a household problem and became a city-wide one. Rapid urban growth. Medieval cities were magnets. People came looking for work, safety, and trade. Villages grew into towns. Towns turned into crowded cities. Streets that once served a few families now held hundreds. But cities were not planned for growth. They expanded by stacking buildings closer together. Houses leaned over streets. Upper floors nearly touched across narrow roads. More people meant more waste, and there was nowhere for it to go. Narrow streets and dense housing. Most medieval streets were narrow. Some were barely wide enough for two people to pass. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Homes were packed tightly. Families lived above shops. Animals lived in courtyards. Workshops dumped scraps directly outside. Air did not move well. Smell lingered. If one house had a problem, the entire street felt it. Cities were living, breathing spaces. They also trapped everything they produced. Open drains and gutters. Without underground sewers, cities relied on open drains. These were shallow channels running along streets. Their job was to carry rainwater and waste downhill. In theory. In reality, drains often clogged. Garbage, straw, animal waste, and human waste all ended up in the same place. When it rained, the drains overflowed. When it did not rain, waste sat still. People stepped around it. Animals walked through it. Children played nearby. The drains were always there. Household waste in the streets. Many households emptied waste directly into the street. Chamber pots were dumped from doors or windows. Buckets of dirty water followed. Scraps from kitchens joined the mix. This was not done out of carelessness. It was normal. Waste had to go somewhere. Some cities tried to limit this. Certain hours were set aside for dumping. Some streets were designated for waste flow. But rules were hard to enforce. Convenience often won. Bells, warnings, and customs. To avoid accidents, cities developed customs. Before dumping waste from a window, people shouted warnings. In some places, bells were rung. Words were yelled. Everyone knew to step aside. Did it always work? No. But it showed awareness. People knew the danger. They tried to manage it with sound and habit instead of pipes and pumps. It was a system built on cooperation and patience. Why cities smelled constantly? Medieval cities smelled because everything that created odor stayed close. Waste, animals, cooking fires, tanneries, butcher shops, and open drains all shared the same air. There was no escape. Smell was strongest in low areas where waste collected. Streets near markets were especially bad. Warm weather made it worse. People burned herbs and incense. Windows stayed open when possible. But smell never fully left. It became background noise. Something you stopped noticing unless it suddenly changed. Summer versus winter. Season mattered. In summer, heat intensified everything. Waste broke down faster. Flies multiplied. Disease spread more easily. Stagnant water became dangerous. Open drains turned into breeding grounds. Summer was the worst season for smell and sickness. Winter was different. Cold slowed decay. Smell was less intense. But frozen ground made waste removal difficult. Cesspits could not be emptied easily. Snow hid filth until spring. When the thaw came, everything returned at once. Spring outbreaks were common. The city always on edge. Living in a medieval city meant living close to waste every day. People adapted. They wore sturdy shoes. They learned where to step. They accepted smell as part of urban life. But adaptation did not remove risk. Contaminated water, flies, and constant exposure made cities vulnerable to disease. A single bad season could affect thousands. Growth without infrastructure. The core problem was simple. Cities grew faster than sanitation systems. No one designed medieval cities with sewage in mind. Solutions were added later, piece by piece. Open drains, rules, warnings. They helped. But they were never enough. The price of being together. Cities offered opportunity. They also concentrated danger. The closer people lived, the more waste they produced, and the harder it was to manage. Medieval cities were loud, busy, and alive. They were also fragile. In the next chapter, we will look beneath the streets, into cesspits and hidden spaces, and see how the most dangerous part of medieval sanitation was often the part no one could see. For now, rest. Even in the busiest city, night still came quietly. Chapter 6: The Cesspit Beneath Your Feet. Most medieval sanitation problems were easy to see. Dirty streets, open drains, overflowing pits. But the most dangerous part was often hidden. Right beneath people's feet. The cesspit was quiet, dark, and out of sight. And that is exactly what made it so dangerous. What cesspits were. A cesspit was a hole dug into the ground to collect human waste. That is it. No pipes. No flow. No exit. Waste from privies, chamber pots, and sometimes garderobes ended up in these pits. They were usually lined with stone, brick, or wood to keep the walls from collapsing. Some were small. Some were deep. Some were built carefully. Others were rushed. They sat under courtyards, basements, streets, and sometimes directly under homes. People lived their lives above them, often without thinking about what was below. How they were dug and maintained. Digging a cesspit was dirty work. A pit was dug by hand. Soil was removed bucket by bucket. The walls were lined, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. A cover was placed on top. Once built, the pit filled slowly. When it became full, it needed to be emptied. This job was done by specialized workers, often at night. They scooped out waste, loaded it into carts, and hauled it away. This was dangerous work. The air inside pits was toxic. Many workers became sick. Some died. Because of this, pits were not emptied as often as they should have been. Many were left to overflow. Leakage into the ground. Even when built well, cesspits leaked. Liquid waste seeped through stone linings. Soil absorbed it. Over time, this moisture spread outward. The ground around a cesspit slowly became saturated. There was no barrier. No waterproof lining. Nothing to stop the spread. and people had no way to see it happening. Wells placed too close. Medieval cities depended on wells. Wells were dug deep to reach clean water, but they were often placed dangerously close to cesspits. Space was limited. Builders did what they could. Unfortunately, water moves. Contaminated liquid from cesspits traveled through soil and reached wells. Drinking water became unsafe without any visible change. The water looked clear. It tasted fine. And it made people sick. Why contamination was invisible? This was the greatest danger. People trusted their senses. If water did not smell bad, it was considered safe. If it looked clear, it was assumed clean. But bacteria cannot be seen. Medieval people did not know this. They blamed sickness on bad air, curses, or fate. The real cause sat silently underground. Even careful households could not protect themselves. Slow poisoning of neighborhoods. Cesspit contamination did not cause sudden disaster. It caused slow damage. People drank slightly contaminated water every day. They became weak. Children fell ill. Death rates increased quietly. Entire neighborhoods suffered without understanding why. Moving did not always help. The problem spread underground. This made cesspits one of the most dangerous sanitation systems of the Middle Ages. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were invisible. The illusion of safety. People felt safe inside their homes. They swept floors. They opened windows. They cleaned surfaces. None of that touched the problem beneath the ground. The cesspit waited patiently. Why the system survived so long? Despite the danger, cesspits remained common for centuries. They were cheap. They required little space. They worked well enough for a time. Most importantly, people did not understand the risk. You cannot fix what you cannot see. Living above the unknown. Medieval life was filled with uncertainty. People accepted risk as normal. They trusted what they could see. And the cesspit stayed hidden. In the next chapter, we will meet the people who dealt with this danger directly. The workers who cleaned waste, often at great personal risk. For now, rest. History's quietest threats are often the most deadly. Chapter 7: The people who cleaned human waste. Every system has people behind it. In medieval cities, sanitation did not work on its own. Pits did not empty themselves. Waste did not politely walk away. Someone had to deal with it. Those people were real. They had names, families, and lives. And they worked in conditions most others avoided at all costs. They were known as gong farmers and night soil collectors. Without them, medieval cities would have collapsed under their own filth. Gong farmers and night soil collectors. A gong farmer was a person whose job was to empty cesspits and latrines. The name sounds strange now, but in medieval times, everyone knew what it meant. Gong farmers handled human waste for a living. Night soil collectors did similar work, often transporting waste out of the city for use as fertilizer. This was not part-time work. It was a full occupation. And it was one of the least desired jobs in medieval society. When and how they worked. Most of this work happened at night. Cities were quieter. Streets were less crowded. Smell mattered a little less when people were asleep. Under cover of darkness, gong farmers opened cesspits. They climbed down ladders into dark holes filled with waste. They shoveled it into buckets by hand. Slowly. Carefully. One slip could mean injury. Or worse. Once filled, buckets were lifted out and loaded onto carts. These carts were then taken outside city walls, to dumping grounds or fields. The work was long, exhausting, and constant. Cities never stopped producing waste. The tools they used, the tools were simple. Shovels, buckets, ropes, ladders, sometimes wooden boards to stand on, sometimes cloth wrapped around the face to block smell. There were no gloves, no masks, no protection, only experience and caution. Some workers carried herbs to cover odors. Others chewed strong-smelling plants to dull their senses. None of this made the job safe. It just made it possible. Social stigma. Gong farmers were necessary. They were also avoided. People did not invite them into their homes. They were not welcomed in taverns. They lived on the edges of society. Their work marked them. Smell followed them. Reputation followed them. Children were warned not to go near them. Adults kept their distance. And yet everyone depended on them. Health risks they faced. The job was dangerous. Cesspits contained toxic gases. Breathing them could cause dizziness, sickness, or death. Workers sometimes collapsed inside pits. Cuts became infected easily. Illness was common. Lifespans were shorter. Few people volunteered for this work. Those who did often had no other choice. Why their work was essential. Without waste removal, cities would have drowned in filth. Cesspits would overflow. Streets would become unusable. Water sources would be destroyed. Disease would spread faster. Gong farmers were part of the city's survival system. They worked quietly. At night. Out of sight. Their absence would have been noticed immediately. How cities depended on them. Cities relied on schedules. On routes. On experience. Local authorities hired gong farmers. Laws regulated their work. Payments were arranged. Even kings and councils knew they could not ignore sanitation forever. Progress depended on these workers. Invisible heroes. History rarely remembers them. No statues. No songs. But medieval cities could not function without them. They were invisible heroes of a dirty system. A quiet respect. Despite the stigma, there was a quiet understanding. People avoided gong farmers, but they also knew not to insult them too openly. You might need them tomorrow. Humanizing the system. Sanitation was not just holes and pits. It was people. People who did hard work so others could sleep safely above ground. In the next chapter, we will return to water itself and see how sanitation failures traveled through wells and streams, turning something essential into something deadly. For now, rest. Even the dirtiest work kept the city alive. Chapter 8: Water Sources and Fatal Mistakes. Water was life in the Middle Ages. It cooked food. It cleaned bodies. It kept animals alive. It quenched thirst. And quietly it spread disease. Medieval toilets and medieval water were never truly separate. They lived close together. Sometimes far too close. And that closeness led to some of the deadliest mistakes of everyday life. Wells, rivers, and rainwater. Most medieval people got their water from three main sources. Wells were the most trusted. They were dug deep and lined with stone. Clear water came up cool and refreshing. People believed deeper meant safer. Rivers were used everywhere. They powered mills, washed clothes, cleaned tools, and provided drinking water, especially for those who lived nearby. Rainwater was collected from roofs and stored in barrels. It seemed clean. It fell from the sky after all. Each source felt natural. Each source could become deadly. Why people reused contaminated water. Water was precious. Fetching it took time and effort. Carrying it was heavy work. So water was reused whenever possible. Water used for washing clothes might later be poured into gardens. Water used for cleaning floors might end up in drains. Wastewater flowed back into streets, pits, and rivers. Nothing was truly thrown away. This made sense in a world without pumps or pipes. But it meant contamination traveled easily. Washing versus drinking water confusion. Medieval people did not clearly separate water for washing and water for drinking. If water looked clean, it was often used for both. A river could be used to rinse clothes upstream and collect drinking water downstream. A well near a cesspit could still seem safe. People trusted appearance. If water was clear and cold, it felt clean. Unfortunately, disease does not care how water looks. How waste traveled unseen. Waste rarely stayed where it was dumped. Rain carried it through streets. Soil absorbed it. Groundwater moved it slowly underground. Rivers carried waste for miles. Wells pulled contaminated water upward without warning. The movement was quiet. Invisible. People drank from the same sources day after day, unaware that waste from their own homes had returned to them. This was not negligence. It was physics they did not understand. Why boiling water was rare. Boiling water sounds like an easy solution. In medieval times, it was not. Fuel was expensive. Firewood took labor to gather. Coal was not widely available. Boiling large amounts of water daily was unrealistic. Water was also believed to be healthier when cold and fresh. Warm water was sometimes seen as stale or unhealthy, so people drank it as it was. Clear, cold, and dangerous. The slow spread of illness. Waterborne illness did not strike all at once. It spread slowly. A child would get sick. A neighbor would feel weak. A household would lose someone quietly. People blamed bad air, weather, fate. The true cause remained hidden in wells and rivers. Outbreaks would rise, then fade, then return. Entire communities suffered without understanding why. Daily life continued. Despite illness, life went on. People still fetched water, still washed clothes, still drank from familiar sources. There was no alternative. You cannot stop using water. Small changes, big consequences. Even small changes made a difference. A new cesspit near a well. A flood that spread waste farther than usual. A dry season that concentrated contamination. Suddenly, sickness increased. No warning. No explanation. The tragedy of trust. The greatest mistake was trust. People trusted water because they had to. It sustained them. It felt pure. It looked harmless. They could not see what lived inside it. A world without germs. Without knowledge of bacteria, people could not connect toilets to disease. They treated symptoms, not causes. And the causes flowed quietly beneath their feet. A fragile balance. Water was both friend and enemy. It kept medieval life moving. It also carried danger into every home. In the next chapter, we will look at what medieval people believed caused disease, and how those beliefs shaped their responses to sanitation problems. For now, rest. Even clear water can hide a story. Chapter 9, Disease Without Understanding Germs. Imagine trying to fix a problem you cannot see. Now imagine you also do not know what the problem is. That was medieval medicine. People were getting sick. They were dying in large numbers. And no one truly understood why. To them, disease felt random, cruel, sometimes even personal. The tragedy was not just the illness. It was the misunderstanding. No germ theory. Medieval people had no concept of germs. They did not know about bacteria, viruses, or microscopic life. Nothing that small existed in their understanding of the world. If something could not be seen, touched, or smelled, it was very hard to believe it mattered. So when disease spread, people searched for causes they could sense. And that led them in the wrong direction. The belief in miasma. The most common explanation for disease was miasma. Miasma meant bad air. People believed that foul smells caused illness. Rotting waste, stagnant water, and decay were thought to release poisonous air that entered the body. If the air smelled bad, it was dangerous. If it smelled clean, it was safe. This idea made sense at the time. After all, sickness often appeared in places that smelled terrible. The problem was not the smell. It was what the smell came from. Smell is a false indicator. Smell became the main warning system. People trusted their noses. If water smelled fine, it was assumed safe. If a room smelled bad, it was blamed for illness. If a street stank, it was feared. But many deadly diseases came from water that smelled clean. Clear wells, fresh rivers, cool rainwater. No warning, no odor. Meanwhile, strong smells from waste or tanneries were blamed, even when they were not the direct cause. Smell pointed attention in the wrong direction. Dysentery. One of the most common diseases linked to sanitation was dysentery. It caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and weakness. It spread easily through contaminated water and food. Medieval people saw dysentery as a curse or punishment. They treated it with herbs, prayers, and rest. They blamed bad air, bad food, or bad luck. They did not realize it often came from drinking water touched by waste. By the time symptoms appeared, the damage was already done. Typhoid. Typhoid was slower, quieter, and more dangerous. It caused fever, confusion, and exhaustion. It spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation. Whole households could fall ill one by one. Because it did not appear immediately, people struggled to connect it to a source. They blamed weather changes, or fatigue, or divine will. The well stayed in use. The disease stayed alive. Cholera-like outbreaks. True cholera became widespread later, but medieval cities experienced similar outbreaks. Sudden waves of severe diarrhea and vomiting appeared, especially after floods or during warm seasons. People died quickly. Fear spread faster than understanding. Again, bad air was blamed. Streets were cleaned. Fires were lit to purify the air. Perfumes were burned. None of this stopped the water from carrying disease. Why solutions targeted the wrong cause? Because people believed disease came from air, they focused on air. They opened windows. They burned incense. They wore scented herbs. They avoided bad smells. These actions brought comfort. They did not stop disease. Waste was moved to places out of sight, not out of reach. Wells were trusted if they looked clean. Rivers were reused again and again. The real problem flowed quietly underneath everything. Doctors without answers. Medieval doctors were not careless. They studied ancient texts. They observed patients. They tried treatments. But without germ theory, their tools were limited. Bloodletting, herbal mixtures, balancing bodily humors. Sometimes these helped by accident. Often they made things worse. Doctors worked hard. The tragedy was not effort. It was missing knowledge. Faith, fear, and fate. When illness spread, people turned to faith. Churches filled. Processions were held. Prayers were offered. Some believed disease was punishment. Others saw it as a test. This gave meaning to suffering. It did not remove the cause. A world doing its best. It is important to remember this. Medieval people were not foolish. They worked with what they knew. They used logic based on observation. Smell felt like a clear warning sign. Air felt powerful. The real enemy was invisible. The quiet tragedy. Sanitation-related disease killed slowly and quietly. No battles. No dramatic events. Just weakened bodies. Empty beds. Short lives. Entire generations lived without knowing why. A lesson written in loss. The tragedy of medieval disease is not ignorance. It is limitation. Without understanding germs, people fought the wrong enemy. They cleaned the air. The danger was in the water. In the next chapter, we will see places that tried to do better. Monasteries with their rules, routines, and early sanitation systems. For now, rest. History is quiet when it hurts the most. Chapter 10: Monasteries, surprisingly advanced but still dangerous. When people think of medieval sanitation, monasteries often sound like the clean places. Quiet, orderly, disciplined. And in many ways they were. Compared to crowded cities and overflowing castles, monasteries were surprisingly advanced. They followed rules. They planned their spaces. They cared about routine and cleanliness. But even with all that structure, monasteries were not safe from sanitation problems. They were better, just not immune. Monastic discipline and cleanliness. Monastic life was built around order. Monks followed strict daily schedules. They woke at fixed hours. They prayed, worked, ate, and slept according to rules written down in detail. Cleanliness was part of discipline. Hands were washed before meals. Living spaces were kept orderly. Waste was managed more carefully than in most towns. This was not about comfort. It was about control. A clean body was seen as part of a disciplined mind. Running water in some monasteries. Some monasteries had something rare in the medieval world. Running water. Through clever engineering, monks redirected nearby streams and springs. Water flowed through channels, courtyards, kitchens, and sometimes latrines. This made monasteries feel advanced. Water moved instead of sitting still. Waste was carried away more effectively. Washing became easier. Compared to city homes, this was impressive. It felt almost modern. Communal latrines over streams. Many monasteries used communal latrines built over flowing water. Rows of stone seats sat above channels. Waste dropped directly into moving streams beneath. The idea was simple. Let water carry waste away. This reduced smell. It reduced handling. It reduced visible filth. For a medieval system, it was smart. Monks could use the latrine quietly and return to their duties without carrying chamber pots or buckets. Better design, same risks. But better design did not mean safe design. The streams that carried waste often flowed back into the environment. Sometimes into rivers. Sometimes into fields. Sometimes near wells. The water looked clean. The danger stayed hidden. If the same stream was used downstream for washing or drinking, contamination returned. The system worked visually. It failed biologically. Why monks still fell ill? Despite discipline and planning, monks still became sick. They drank water from nearby sources. They lived close together. They shared meals, sleeping spaces, and routines. When illness entered a monastery, it spread easily. Rules could not stop bacteria. Clean floors did not clean water. Even the most careful monks could not see what they were fighting. The limits of medieval engineering. Monastic builders were skilled. They understood gravity. They understood flow. They understood structure. What they did not understand was contamination at a microscopic level. They believed moving water was safe water. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was not. Engineering solved half the problem. The other half remained invisible. Silence and shared spaces. Monasteries were quiet places. But shared spaces meant shared risk. Communal latrines meant many people used the same system. If contamination occurred, everyone was exposed. One failure affected all. Silence did not mean safety. A false sense of security. Because monasteries looked clean, people trusted them. They smelled better. They looked orderly. They felt controlled. This created a false sense of security. Danger does not always announce itself. Illness as a spiritual test. When monks fell ill, disease was often seen as a spiritual challenge. Suffering was endured quietly. Care was given, but causes were rarely questioned. Faith offered comfort. It did not remove contamination. Better than most, still not enough. It is important to say this clearly. Monasteries were some of the best managed spaces of the Middle Ages. They were cleaner than cities, more organized than castles, but they were still medieval. Without modern sanitation knowledge, even the best systems had limits. A step forward, not the end. Monasteries show us something important. Progress is often partial. They moved sanitation forward. They improved daily life. They reduced some risks. They did not eliminate danger. That would take centuries more. Quiet lessons in stone and water. The remains of monastic latrines still exist today. Stone channels, worn seats, silent systems. They tell a quiet story. People tried. They learned. They did the best they could with what they knew. In the next chapter, we will look at laws and rules. How medieval cities tried to control waste with regulations, fines, and public order. For now, rest. Even the cleanest places had limits in a world without modern knowledge. Chapter 11: Medieval Laws about Human Waste. It is easy to think medieval people did not care about sanitation. That is not true. They cared. A lot. They complained about waste. They argued about it. They passed laws about it. And they fined people who ignored those laws. The problem was not awareness. The problem was enforcement. City regulations on dumping waste. Medieval cities had rules about waste. Many cities banned dumping waste into streets during the day. Others required waste to be thrown only into specific drains or pits. Some cities set fixed hours for dumping, usually early morning or late at night. There were even rules about where chamber pots could be emptied and how far waste had to be carried. These laws existed because waste was clearly dangerous. People slipped in it. Water became polluted. Smell caused fear. Cities did not create these rules for decoration. They created them because life depended on it. Fines and punishments. Breaking sanitation laws came with consequences. Fines were common. People caught dumping waste improperly could be charged money. In repeat cases, punishment could become more severe. Some offenders were forced to clean streets. Others were publicly shamed. In rare cases, jail time was used. These punishments were meant to discourage bad behavior. They worked sometimes, but not always. Why laws were hard to enforce? Enforcing sanitation laws was difficult. Cities were crowded. Streets were narrow. Officials were few. Waste was everywhere. People dumped waste quickly, often at night. Witnesses were rare. Accidents were common. Even when someone was caught, proving intent was hard. Was it carelessness or necessity? Often it was both. Public versus private responsibility. One major problem was responsibility. Who was responsible for sanitation? The city? The household? The landlord? There was no clear answer. Households were expected to manage their own waste. Cities were expected to maintain streets and drains. When something went wrong, blame moved back and forth. Everyone agreed waste was dangerous. No one agreed who should fix it. Evidence that people knew it was dangerous. The existence of these laws proves something important. Medieval people knew waste caused harm. They knew dirty streets led to illness. They knew polluted water was risky. They knew smell often meant danger. They may not have understood germs, but they understood consequences. They acted with the knowledge they had. Rules without infrastructure. The biggest problem was that laws could not replace infrastructure. Telling people not to dump waste did not create sewers. Fining someone did not move a cesspit. Rules tried to control behavior in a system that was already failing. It was like telling people not to spill water on a ship with holes in the floor. Human nature has always been human nature. Some people followed the rules carefully. Some ignored them. Some did their best until it became inconvenient. Sound familiar? Medieval cities struggled with the same issue modern cities do. Rules only work if people can realistically follow them. The gap between law and reality. On paper, medieval sanitation laws looked strict. In reality, they were flexible. Officials overlooked small violations. Neighbors tolerated behavior when necessary. Survival often mattered more than rules. This gap kept cities functioning. It also kept them dirty. Order in a chaotic world. Laws were an attempt to impose order on chaos. They represented hope. Hope that waste could be controlled. That cities could be safer. That life could improve. Sometimes that hope worked. Often it did not. A quiet step toward progress. Even when ineffective, these laws mattered. They showed awareness. They recorded concern. They pushed sanitation into public discussion. They laid the groundwork for future systems. Progress does not begin with perfect solutions. It begins with admitting there is a problem. The law could not see underground. Laws focused on what people could see. Streets, smell, visible dumping. They could not see contamination underground. They could not regulate groundwater or bacteria. The most dangerous threats remained hidden. People tried. This is the important part. Medieval people tried. They argued. They fined. They regulated. They knew waste was dangerous. They just did not yet know how dangerous. In the next chapter, we will see how weather and seasons made sanitation problems worse, turning rain, snow, and heat into powerful forces of disease. For now, rest. Even imperfect rules are signs of a society trying to protect itself. Chapter 12: Winter, Rain, and Overflow. Medieval sanitation was never stable. It changed with the weather. Rain, snow, frost, and thaw all played a role in how waste moved, where it went, and who got sick. Nature did not care about city rules or human plans. And nature often made a bad system worse. Frozen ground preventing pit digging. Winter created an immediate problem. The ground froze. When soil hardened, digging new cesspits became almost impossible. Old pits filled up. New ones could not be made easily. Waste had nowhere to go. Privies overflowed. Chamber pots piled up. Waste stayed closer to living spaces for longer periods of time. People adapted by dumping waste wherever they could. Not ideal, but necessary. Cold slowed decay, which helped with smell. But it also meant waste stayed in place longer. Winter hid the problem. It did not solve it. Flooding spreading waste. Rain was another enemy. Heavy rainfall flooded streets, pits, and low areas. Cesspits overflowed. Moats spilled into surrounding land. Open drains reversed direction. Waste moved where water moved. Suddenly, filth spread into courtyards, homes, and wells. Flooding did not just make cities dirty. It redistributed danger. Rain washing filth into homes. Medieval homes were not sealed tightly. Rainwater entered through doors, windows, and weak foundations. Mud and waste were carried inside. Floors became slick. Bedding got damp. Food storage areas were exposed. People cleaned what they could. But they could not clean everything. Seasonal disease spikes. Disease followed the seasons. Winter weakened bodies through cold and poor nutrition. Spring floods spread contamination. Summer heat intensified bacteria. This created predictable cycles. People noticed patterns even if they did not understand causes. Certain months were feared. Certain seasons brought anxiety. Why spring was often deadly. Spring was especially dangerous. Snow melted. Frozen waste was released. Floodwaters spread filth everywhere. Wells were contaminated. Streets became muddy mixtures of everything accumulated over winter. People resumed normal routines. An illness followed. Spring was the season of renewal. It was also the season of death. A system at the mercy of nature. Medieval sanitation depended on cooperation with the environment. When weather behaved, the system survived. When it did not, people suffered. There was no control, only reaction. People learned to expect it. Over time, people expected sickness during certain seasons. They prepared emotionally. They prayed more. They accepted loss. This does not mean they did not care. It means they adapted. Weather as an unseen force. Rain and snow were invisible players in sanitation. They moved waste faster than any human effort. They ignored laws. They ignored walls. They found every weakness. A quiet reminder. The Middle Ages were not just shaped by people. They were shaped by weather. Nature made sanitation fragile. In the next chapter, we will explore the emotional side of living with constant filth, and how people coped mentally with conditions they could not escape. For now, rest. Even the seasons carried danger in a world without control. Chapter 13: The Psychological Toll of Living with Filth. By this point in the story, it is easy to focus on the physical dangers. Disease. Contaminated water. overflowing waste. But there was another cost to medieval sanitation that rarely appears in history books. The mental one. Living surrounded by filth changes how people think, feel, and respond to danger. And for medieval people, this was not an occasional experience. It was daily life. Constant smell as background noise. Smell was everywhere. It came from streets, drains, animals, kitchens, and waste pits. It drifted through windows and doorways. It settled into clothes and walls. At first, it was probably overwhelming. But over time, it became background noise. Like the sound of wind or distant voices, smell faded into the mind. People stopped reacting to it unless it suddenly changed. A new smell meant danger. An old smell meant normal life. This made medieval people very good at ignoring warning signs. Desensitization to danger. When danger is constant, it loses its power. If waste is always nearby, it stops feeling threatening. People get sick often. Illness becomes expected. If children see death early, they grow up faster. This desensitization helped people survive emotionally, but it also made change harder. When something feels normal, there is less urgency to fix it. Fear mixed with normalcy. Medieval life was full of fear. People feared illness. They feared hunger. They feared bad seasons and bad luck. But fear lived alongside routine. People still worked, still laughed, still raised families. They feared disease, but they also expected it. This strange balance allowed society to function. Fear became quiet. How children grew up around waste. Children did not know a different world. They played in streets with open drains. They watched adults dump waste. They learned where not to step. To them, this was normal. They adapted early. They learned which water to avoid, which smells meant trouble, which seasons brought sickness. This knowledge was practical. It was also sad. Children grew up understanding risk before understanding safety, learning to accept loss. Illness took people often. Families lost children. Neighbors disappeared. Life expectancy was short. Grief was real, but it was also familiar. People mourned, then continued. Acceptance was not indifference. It was survival. Why people accepted it as fate. Without understanding germs, sanitation problems felt unavoidable. If illness came from bad air or divine will, then human control was limited. People did what they could. They cleaned when possible. They followed rules. They prayed. When that failed, they accepted fate. This acceptance protected the mind from constant panic. Humor is a coping tool. Even in difficult conditions, people joked. Medieval writings include humor about smell, waste, and bodily functions. Jokes were crude, but they were human. Laughter helped release tension. If you cannot remove the problem, sometimes you laugh at it. Quiet strength. Living with filth required mental strength. People endured conditions we would find unbearable. They raised families, built cities, created art. They adapted, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The cost of adaptation. Adaptation kept people alive. It also slowed progress. When danger feels normal, urgency fades. People lived with problems instead of solving them fully. This was not failure. It was limitation. A world without escape. There was no break from sanitation issues. No clean zone. No vacation. Filth followed people everywhere. This constant exposure shaped how medieval people viewed the world. Life felt fragile. Loss felt expected. Quiet resilience. Despite everything, people continued. They loved. They planned. They hoped. They built lives in difficult conditions. That quiet resilience deserves respect. A bedtime reflection. As we drift toward rest, this chapter asks us to pause. Not to judge, but to understand. Medieval people lived close to danger, and they adapted their minds to survive it. The cost was heavy, but the strength was real. In the next chapter, we will step back and question a common belief. Were medieval people truly dirty, or is that a modern misunderstanding? For now, rest. Even in the dirtiest streets, people learned how to keep going. Chapter 14, Myths versus Reality. Were medieval people dirty? When people talk about the Middle Ages, one idea shows up again and again. They were dirty. It is said casually, confidently, almost like a fact everyone agrees on. But like many simple ideas about the past, this one is only partly true. Medieval people lived in dirty conditions. That does not mean they liked being dirty, and it does not mean they did nothing to stay clean. Regular washing habits, Despite popular belief, medieval people washed. They washed their hands before meals. They washed their faces in the morning. They rinsed their feet after work. Water was used carefully, but it was used often. People understood that cleanliness mattered for comfort and health, even if they did not fully understand why. Washing was part of routine life, not a rare event. Public bathhouses. In many medieval cities, public bathhouses were common. These were shared spaces where people went to bathe, relax, and socialize. Hot water was available. Steam filled the rooms. Soap was used. Bathhouses were especially popular in the early and high Middle Ages. They were not hidden or secret. They were normal. Some cities had dozens. Soap and hygiene customs. Soap existed. It was made from animal fat and plant ash. It was rough by modern standards, but it worked. People washed clothes regularly. Linen garments were cleaned often. Outer clothing was brushed and aired. Hair was combed. Beards were trimmed. Cleanliness was a goal, not a mystery. The real problem wasn't laziness. Medieval people did not avoid cleanliness because they were lazy. They avoided it because it was difficult. Water had to be carried by hand. Fuel was needed to heat it. Time was limited. You could wash yourself. You could not wash an entire city. Infrastructure limits. This is the key point. The problem was not personal hygiene. It was infrastructure. No sewers. No clean water separation. No waste treatment. Even clean people lived in dirty environments. You could wash your hands and still drink contaminated water. You could bathe and still walk through filth on the way home. Clean habits could not overcome dirty systems. Why the myth survived? The myth of medieval dirtiness comes from comparison. We compare their world to ours. Modern plumbing hides waste. Modern water systems protect us. Modern cities separate clean from dirty. When those systems are invisible, cleanliness feels natural. Medieval people did not have that luxury. So we mistake limitation for neglect. Clean people, dirty surroundings. This is the truth. Medieval people tried to be clean. Their surroundings made it hard. That difference matters. A final correction. Calling medieval people dirty misses the point. They lived in a world without modern tools. They did the best they could. And often they did more than we give them credit for. In the next chapter, we will look at small innovations that slowly changed everything. For now, rest. History is rarely as simple as it sounds. Chapter 15, Small Innovations That Changed Everything. After so many chapters of waste, sickness, and quiet danger, it might feel like medieval sanitation was a story with no hope. But change did come. Not suddenly, not dramatically, and not all at once. It came slowly through small ideas, painful lessons, and moments when things went so wrong that they could no longer be ignored. This is the chapter where things begin to shift. Gradual sewer development. The first big change was simple in theory. Move waste away. Some medieval cities began building early sewer systems. These were not the clean, underground tunnels we know today. They were basic channels, often covered, designed to carry waste out of populated areas. Sometimes they followed old Roman systems. Sometimes they were built from scratch. They were narrow, smelly, imperfect, but they moved waste. And that alone made a difference. Better waste separation. Another small but important change was separation. Cities slowly learned that mixing everything together was a bad idea. Human waste, animal waste, rainwater, drinking water. When all of it shared the same space, disaster followed. So rules and designs began to separate them. Wells were placed farther from cesspits. Waste channels were directed away from water sources. Certain areas were kept for dumping, others for living. This did not eliminate danger, but it reduced it. Urban planning lessons learned painfully. Cities learned by suffering. Outbreaks forced reflection. Floods revealed weak points. Entire neighborhoods getting sick made patterns impossible to ignore. Streets were widened. Drains were improved. New building rules were introduced. None of this was quick, but it was progress. Each mistake left a mark. How disasters forced change. Disasters were the real teachers. Plagues, floods, mass illness. When too many people died too quickly, explanations had to change. Officials began to connect waste, water, and sickness, even without understanding germs. They did not know why it worked. They just knew it did. Slow improvement, not revolution. This was not a sanitation revolution. It was a series of small steps. A covered drain here. A new rule there. A rebuilt street after a fire or flood. Each change made life slightly safer. Resistance and reality. Not everyone welcomed change. New systems cost money. They required labor. They disrupted daily life. Some people resisted. But reality pushed back harder. When old systems failed repeatedly, even the stubborn adapted. The long road forward. These innovations did not fix everything. Disease continued. Waste still existed. But the direction had changed. People were learning. Hope without perfection. This chapter is not about success. It is about momentum. For the first time, sanitation was improving faster than population growth. That mattered. A quiet turning point. Most people living through these changes did not realize they were part of something important. They just noticed fewer smells, fewer floods, slightly safer water. Sometimes progress is quiet. From survival to prevention. The biggest shift was mindset. Sanitation stopped being only about reacting. It slowly became about prevention. And that idea would change everything in the centuries to come. A gentle pause. This chapter marks a transition. From darkness toward light. From endurance toward understanding. Not the end of the problem, but the beginning of the solution. In the next chapter, we will step back and look at why medieval sanitation still matters today, and what it quietly teaches us about the world we live in now. For now, rest. Even small changes can carry a lot of hope. Chapter 16. Why medieval bathrooms matter today. After all the pits, pots, moats, smells, and quiet disasters, it is fair to ask one question. Why does any of this matter now? We do not live in medieval cities. We do not dump waste into streets. We do not drink from wells next to cesspits. So why talk about medieval bathrooms at all? Because the things we no longer notice are often the things protecting us the most. Sanitation as an invisible privilege. Modern sanitation is invisible. That is its greatest success. Waste disappears with a sound and is gone. Clean water arrives with a turn of a handle. Streets are washed. Drains carry rain away. Most of us never think about it, and that is the point. When something works perfectly, it fades into the background of life. Medieval people lived with sanitation every day. We live without noticing it at all. That difference is a privilege. How modern plumbing prevents pandemics. Modern plumbing does not just add comfort. It saves lives. Separating drinking water from waste prevents diseases that once killed millions. Sewers carry danger away before it can return. Water treatment removes threats we cannot see. Most modern pandemics are slowed or stopped because sanitation exists. Not medicine first. Sanitation first. It is the quiet shield that never sleeps. The lesson hidden in pipes. Medieval history teaches us something important. Disease is not only about sickness. It is about systems. When waste and water mix, illness follows. When cities grow without planning, danger grows with them. When infrastructure fails, people suffer. These lessons are not old. They are constant. Public health is not personal. One of the biggest lessons from medieval sanitation is this. Public health cannot be solved by individual behavior alone. Medieval people washed. They tried to be clean. They followed rules. And they still got sick. Because the system was broken. Clean hands mean little if the water is contaminated. This is still true today. Why we forget so easily? Because modern sanitation works, we forget it exists. We notice it only when it fails. A water outage. A flood. A broken sewer. Suddenly, panic returns. History reminds us that these systems are not guaranteed. They are built, maintained, protected, or lost. Modern cities are not immune. Even today, cities without proper sanitation face the same dangers medieval cities did. Contaminated water, disease outbreaks, silent spread. The difference is not time. The difference is infrastructure. Where systems fail, history repeats. Quiet gratitude for clean water. This chapter is not meant to scare. It is meant to slow us down. To notice something small. A glass of clean water. A working toilet. A street that drains after rain. These are not small things. They are the result of centuries of learning, suffering, and change. Medieval people paid the price. The knowledge we have today was earned the hard way. Through loss. Through illness. Through generations living without answers. Medieval bathrooms were not disgusting because people were careless. They were dangerous because knowledge had not arrived yet. Their suffering built our safety. A final connection. When you use clean water, you are connected to the past, to people who lived without it, to cities that struggled, to systems that failed. History lives quietly in the things that work. Why this story matters. This story is not really about toilets. It is about how societies care for themselves, how invisible systems shape life, how progress often comes slowly, painfully, and without applause. A bedtime thought. As we come to the end of this journey, there is one gentle thought to carry into rest. Comfort is not automatic. It is built, maintained, and protected. Quiet gratitude. So tonight, when water runs clean and waste disappears without thought, take a moment. Not to feel guilty, but to feel grateful. Many lived so we could forget. And that forgetting is a sign of success. This closes our story of medieval bathrooms. A strange topic, a quiet lesson, and a reminder that the most important systems in life are often the ones we never see. Rest well. History has done its work for the night.